productivity in the business world is the thing that will either keep you employed or unemployed. When you are hired by a company whose purpose is to do business and make money, it is often understood that what you do has to contribute to that overall reason why that business exists. At one point, my dear wife, who is here, I like to pick on her every so often, had been working for SunTrust Bank in Roanoke, and the branch was located in a Kroger grocery store. And one of the things that they were told, the staff of SunTrust, was to get on the floor of the store and talk to some people about possibly opening an account with SunTrust. Now, if you've ever dealt with salespersons, you know that if you go to the grocery store, you're there for mayonnaise, you're there for eggs, you're not there to open an account. If you're there to open an account, you're going to the branch. And so there you ran into my sweet wife, dressed up and smiling a lot wider than now because there was something writing on the back of that smile. She greeted you partially because she greets people, pastor's wife, sweet lady, but most importantly because there was productivity expected at the end of the day. Now, some of the conversations that she and I had concerning that I cannot share with the congregation, but I can tell you that sometimes it's not easy. Approaching a total stranger and talking to them about things that may not have much interest for them, might not be of interest to them, and yet being productive is what's expected. When I was younger, I remember during the planting season, every Saturday, we would wake up 5 o'clock in the morning. We had a long walk to take to get to the fields. And I remember one time my father tying a bag of corn seed on the bike, and he rode ahead of us and told us that we would catch up with him once we got to the field. And that day we were to plant the corn. Before planting the corn, we'd been at the field and prepared the soil in contours. We formed the ridges. And so that day, my mother went ahead of us, and she would dig a little dimple into the ridge. Then I would follow behind my mother with a handful of corn seed, and I would drop one in each dimple. My sister walked behind me, and she would cover the soil on top of the dimple. So we did that roll after roll after roll after roll after roll. And at the end of the day, we sat down under the tree and took a drink of water. Parents shared a few stories. We rested up a little bit before we got back on the journey back home. Monday, I went to school. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, it was time to go back to the field. And during the week, I hadn't thought much about what we had done the previous Saturday. So as soon as we approached the fields, as far as the eye could see, were these little green shoots that had just come out of the ridges. As far as the eye could see, one after another, spaced, consistent with the ridges that the dimples that my mother had put into the ridges, spaced consistent with the seeds that I had dropped into those dimples, spaced consistent with the ground that my sister had covered over those dimples. The corn had come up. Everything that we had done was done consistent with growing corn. The conditions were good. The soil was good. It had rained. Germination had taken place. And with time, we would have some corn. In the parable that we've just read from in the gospel, we have Jesus addressing a crowd. They had been pressing in on him. They had heard some things about him and wanted to hear even more. Some of the ones that had come that day had never heard Jesus before, but they had been told by friends that this was the man that everybody should listen to. He's got some words that you need to hear. And so more and more people were coming in and they were crowding around Jesus, so that he felt that the best way to address the crowd is if he got onto a boat and then push off a little bit so that it has better staging, so that he then could proceed with sharing the word of God. So he got onto a boat and then he pushed back, and then the people sat on the sand and he began to tell them the parable. Now, if you've looked up the meaning of the word parable in the sense of theology, you will learn that a parable is an earthly story that is told in order to communicate a heavenly meaning. It's an earthly story that has spiritual implications behind it. So whenever Jesus tells a parable, he wants people to understand the spiritual things using image that they're familiar with. So if Jesus were with us, he could tell a parable that may have Dale Boulevard in it, or Delaney, because that's where we have quite a few members of our congregation. So he could use a parable that talks about Prince William County. But then behind that would be a spiritual meaning that he wanted everybody that heard that parable familiar with Dale Boulevard, familiar with Delaney, familiar with Prince William County, to then apply to their walk with him. Parables were never told to entertain, although Jesus was quite a genius when you heard him tell parables. They were always intended to produce some spiritual fruit out of those people that had heard them. So what we have here is the parable of the sower of seed. Now Jesus looked at the audience and realized that they were all familiar with farming. This was an agricultural society. They knew what it meant to plant seed. They were familiar with the terrain that would be covered in this parable, and therefore could understand and appreciate what Jesus was saying. But most importantly, having understood or learned something from what Jesus was saying, they would each look at themselves in the mirror and ask the question, what does this mean for me? And I suppose that's why we are here this morning. We did not leave our comfortable homes to just come here and spend some time. That's part of it. We did not just leave our comfortable homes to come here and connect with our dearly beloved brand new pastor. That's great. But that's not the only reason. We did not come here because we had nothing else to do, and out of boredom, the church is where I need to be Sunday. We came here because God has something to say to us individually, and as we go back home, we're each going to look in the mirror and ask, including myself, what does this mean for me in my walk with God? So there they sat, and he began to tell them this parable concerning a farmer. Now they were familiar with farming. And there are two parts